Well, good day to everyone, and I'd like to welcome you today to the second day of our Philosophy, Disability and Social Change conference, year five, amazingly enough. My name is Jonathan Wolff, Joe Wolff. I'm a white man with glasses, aging, sadly, grey hair, black top, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Blavatnik School of Government, who are hosting for us today, and also my co-organizer, Shelley Tremaine, who has put the program together and, as in previous years, has done a really incredible job. So let us get started, and I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Jane Dryden, who is speaking on behalf of herself and Amandine Cattler, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Their paper is Shifting the Vulnerability Economy, Autism and Unmasking. And so, Jane, over to you.
Excellent, fantastic. So yes, I'm sorry you're just you're just getting me today. Amandine is away, so I'm Jane Dryden, she, her pronouns. I'm at Allison University in New Brunswick. I'm a white woman with short blonde hair and black and blue framed glasses and a blue shirt and blue and white earrings that hopefully won't be too loud. I'm speaking from Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where I am a settler. Settlers' relationship to and privilege to live on this territory was agreed upon in the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752. So just a quick word about the slides. There's no images on any of the slides, just some text to help follow the main points. So there's nothing in there that's not going to be in the talk proper. The format in general, in case you're curious, is I think a dark teal. I'm bad at colors, with a kind of jaunty red square on the top right. Just let me make sure that I'm clicked through. Okay. So the inspiration for the paper comes from a lot of just recent calls, especially in self-help spaces and pop cultural spaces, to sort of embrace your vulnerability, right? We can think of someone like Brené Brown, who has one of the top TED Talks, millions and millions of views, about embracing vulnerability. Folks who are familiar with things like RuPaul's Drag Race will know the sort of talk of, like, really embrace that vulnerability that the judges are looking for. So there's sort of a lot of talk about vulnerability here. But then on the other hand, right, there's sort of this whole other world of talk about vulnerability in which autistic people are viewed and treated as a quote unquote vulnerable population in the context of bioethics, autism research, clinical and medical spheres. And so what does this vulnerability mean? What does vulnerability entail, based not on third-person medicalized stipulations about autism, but on first-person autistic perspectives and our own self-understanding, experience, community-given reflection? So what does vulnerability mean for autistic people in an autistic context? And then what are some of the connections between vulnerability and expectations of neuronormativity and autistic masking? So we're kind of looking at this question of vulnerability largely through this sort of issue of concerns around masking. We'll use the term masking throughout the talk. There's some discussion in the scholarly literature about separating out masking versus camouflaging, et cetera. But we're just going to keep it simple for here. So for autistic people, embracing vulnerability might mean unmasking, but this has risks, right? And so how would we mitigate them? So what Amandine and I are interested in arguing is that we want to say that dealing with this involves shifting the vulnerability economy. Who is allowed to be vulnerable? Who is allowed to be themselves? And what kind of space do we make for autistics to be vulnerable? And we want to argue that this isn't just an individual thing, like a pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and embrace your vulnerability kind of thing. It shouldn't just be on autistics to make a space for themselves. It requires a whole community effort to shift. And I do want to say, just before we get started, we do want to recognize that, of course, not all autistic people mask or are able to mask. We do think that a lot of what we say ultimately about shifting the vulnerability economy will be helpful to autistic folks who don't mask in the first place, but this is the specific focus for the paper around masking. Okay, so there's sort of two types of theory of vulnerability that we can kind of find in a lot of the vulnerability literature. So two different conceptions of vulnerability at play that we want to make a distinction of between. So on the one hand, there are theories that are concerned with vulnerability as harm, which we call, shockingly, harm vulnerability. And this involves sort of vulnerability as susceptibility to or risk of harm. And then the task following from these theories is to identify sources of vulnerability in order to mitigate, reduce, or eliminate them. But there's also at the same time another collection of theories of vulnerability, a different sort of view that involves conceiving of vulnerability as a kind of existential sense of openness to the world, an openness to being affected that's not only harm, but also really good things as well. And so we call this openness vulnerability. This form of vulnerability is a condition of potential and connection. And so the task on this sort of theory is to accept and understand and even embrace it. So just before I get further started into talking more about theories of vulnerability, I do want to say a bit more about masking. So I apologize for the sheer amount of text on this slide. There's a lot of it, but I'll go through it. So it's important to understand, it's important for how we understand autistic masking. So masking requires both hiding and performing. Suppressing one's discomfort, stims, social anxiety, and other difficulties that arise in the context of neuronormative interactions and communication. It also involves acting as much as possible in a neuronormative way by doing things like engaging in small talk, making eye contact, controlling stims in public settings, attending large social events, or also just putting up with sort of sensory things, loud, bright, crowded, or excessively cold or warm environments. It's sort of exhausting. It can take a really significant toll, leading to autistic meltdowns, shutdowns, as well as burnout, just sort of the sheer exhaustion of living in a world that's not made for you. So this is all a lot of work. We think that masking is often an attempt to reduce the harm vulnerability that autistics face in a neuronormative world, right? So trying to kind of, blend in a sense, at the cost of denying openness vulnerability. And we think that having to stifle openness vulnerability to avoid harm creates an unjust state of affairs. So the neuronormative status quo produces and maintains different allocations of vulnerability between autistics and neurotypicals. So now that we've got sort of that in mind, here's a bit more about how we see the different kinds of theories. So just a sketch on harm vulnerability theories. Most approaches to vulnerability frame it as susceptibility to or risk of harm. Lots of different theories here. We're going to highlight two that we think are particularly helpful for accounting for harms experienced by autistic people in neuronormative contexts. So a really flexible and useful approach within this group is that of Florencia Luna, who describes a vulnerability as occurring in layers, so that the interrelations between and sort of compounding effects of different sources of vulnerability can be appreciated and guarded against. So these layers can be thought of as dispositions that could be triggered by a stimulus. So as a disposition, they're present even when the person is not necessarily experiencing harm. Some layers have consequences that create or exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. She calls these cascade effects. So her approach can then be used to help policymakers and researchers identify and evaluate layers, triggers, and cascading effects, focusing on the most harmful first. So we can use then different strategies, protections, safeguards, and sort of work to empowerment and the generation of autonomy. So, this kind of analysis can be useful in the case of autistic people. So for example, rather than attributing, for instance, lower employment rates or worse health outcomes to apparently intrinsic autistic traits, we could analyze how cascade layers of vulnerability and increased risk and stigma and stereotype and barriers all play a role, which can help us identify targets for change and improvement. Another approach to considering how vulnerability develops in recent discussions of vulnerabilization, which of course Shelley Tremaine has written about. So on this account, vulnerability is definitely not an individual characteristic that individuals sort of have. To quote Shelley, vulnerability is a naturalized apparatus of power that differentially produces subjects materially, socially, politically, and relationally. And so it's through a contingent political process in which people are vulnerabilized. So writing within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, scholars Larios and Patterson note that this concept of vulnerabilization has really gained a lot of traction, that it's really helpful to kind of talk about this political process of certain groups becoming vulnerabilized through social and policy arrangements. So this really resists kind of some individualizing tendencies in some vulnerability discourses. On this sort of approach, then the task is to identify the kinds of processes of vulnerabilization in order to challenge and resist them. So both the layers approach and the vulnerabilization approach draw attention to the relational contexts of vulnerability in useful ways, while also consistently conceiving of vulnerability in terms of harm. In both cases, our task is to identify processes and what's happening in order to figure out how to resist it. In both cases, our overall goal is to reduce vulnerability insofar as it's associated with harm. So, harm vulnerability theories. Of course, on our view, a focus on harm vulnerabilities on their own is insufficient. And we think that one of the key ways actually of reducing harm vulnerability created by neuronormativity involves a more general cultivation of an acceptance of a different kind of vulnerability altogether, a kind that would also help open up more possibilities for how to be. And this alternate approach frames vulnerability in terms of openness. So as Erin Gilson writes, openness, vulnerability is a kind of openness to being affected and affecting in both positive and negative ways. It includes bodily, psychological, economic, emotional, and legal vulnerabilities. She describes it, vulnerability is a bit ambivalent. It includes harm and benefit. So openness vulnerability theorists aren't kind of just Pollyannas thinking everything is always good. It's a condition of potential that makes possible other conditions. So it makes possible suffering and being prey to violence, but also falling in love, pleasure, learning, to sort of, open yourself up to all sorts of things. Danielle Petherbridge also has a kind of openness account that comes in 3 dimensions. For her, corporeal openness involves a kind of acknowledgement of the richness of sensuality alongside the propensity for suffering. And this can connect with a lot of sources of autistic joy, such as just reveling in sensory play and the material world through stimming. Psychological openness affirms the individual while avoiding a form of psychic closure or claim of absolute sovereignty. So recognizing our vulnerability here helps us come to terms with the fact that we can't be absolute masters of ourselves, but are always developing. And then finally, openness to the other recognizes our interdependence, which is crucial in an autistic context, given a lot of fixes support needs. But of course, that also means exposure to forms of power and abuses of vulnerability, which then connects to the next slide. So as I said, Petherbridge notes the risks of exposure to forms of power and abuses of vulnerability. So autistic people often have support needs for which they require the assistance of others, which can render them vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. They can also be subject to bullying and social exclusion, especially if they're perceived as behaving differently from allistics or non-autistic people. So given these risks, some might say, well, shouldn't we just focus on the harm vulnerability? Should we analyze cascading layers of vulnerability? Should we be analyzing processes of vulnerabilization for autistic people? But we think, again, that thinking of autistic relations with others primarily in terms of harm vulnerability risks failing to recognize the positive modalities that are possible within openness vulnerability. Again, the same kind of openness that makes abuse possible also makes possible strong bonds of love and acceptance, which can serve as sort of really powerful supports in and of themselves in overcoming shame and in cultivating allies and solidarity. And this connects, of course, to longstanding arguments within disability theory about centering conceptions of human interdependence. So in order to understand how this sort of plays out, we, of course, need to understand the effects and pressures of neuronormativity. So neuronormativity, this audience probably knows this pretty well, but neuronormativity involves a dominant set of norms, assumptions, expectations, and practices in which Neuronormalized modes of cognition are seen as the only acceptable ones. This general state of affairs stigmatizes and marginalizes neurominoritized ways of being, doing, communicating, and processing, and sees them as deviant and inferior. It overall structures space, temporality, interactions, and communication. It includes stereotypes and misconceptions about autistic people. And we argue that it actually creates a significant source of harm vulnerability for autistic people. In response to this, many autistic people then mask, as we saw, to shield themselves from the harms of neuronormativity, to avoid or reduce stigmatization, marginalization, and violence. So again, remember that possible responses to harm vulnerability involve trying to mitigate or reduce sources of harm. But of course, masking comes with its own set of harms, as we saw, autistic meltdowns, shutdowns, burnout. And it requires an immense amount of energy that could have been allocated elsewhere. And we think the perceived need to mask to mitigate neuronormative harms places an undue burden on autistic people. So unmasking then, as a form of embracing openness vulnerability, can allow greater appreciation of sensory play and possibilities for autistic joy, as well as possibilities for unlearning neuronormative habits and practices. But crucially, this isn't just an individual task. This all takes place within neuronormative contexts and risks, and so it requires a shared effort to make spaces safer for openness vulnerability. The capacity to develop and gain the self-confidence or self-trust necessary to embrace openness, vulnerability, and to engage in the process of unmasking requires community support, communities that provide a safe space and encouragement, such as those provided by autistic communities, autistic self-advocacy, but we also want to argue that come more generally from everyone. Support from autistic communities alone can't remove these barriers. It requires collaboration from neurotypicals. And so it's crucial that neurotypicals also learn to embrace and work on the discomfort that they might feel. We do want to note that it's important to recognize the intersectional factors in social location concerning who is safe, when and where. This talk focuses specifically on questions around autistic masking, but of course, these are going to sort of play out differently. Whereas a cis white woman might end up feeling safe stimming in certain places, a BIPOC, trans, or non-binary person might be utterly unsafe doing so because of the risk of being perceived as a threat, or so forth. And of course, we see this happening. So we do want to recognize that this has to be part of the larger analysis. So just the next slide, I'm just going to give a quick example of how this can work. I'm just looking at the time and double checking that everything is still okay. So in the larger paper that Amandine and I are working on together, we explore this interrelationship between harm and openness vulnerability, and this need to, as we say, shift the vulnerability economy in both education contexts and healthcare contexts. For reasons of time, I'm just going to sort of talk about the healthcare contexts in this talk. So very basically, again, we think that both types of analysis of vulnerability are important because they pick up on different things. So in context of healthcare, it's important to analyze forms of harm vulnerability that can occur. So there's lots of barriers for autistic people seeking healthcare, including difficulty with the telephone, difficulties feeling understood and communicating. We can think of, for example, work on the double empathy problem within autism studies. There's issues with the waiting room environment and sensory issues. I mean, waiting room environments, they're just so awful. We can think about fear and anxiety about how people are going to be perceived or whether they're taken seriously. We can think about cost. Again, sort of picking up on the intersectional aspects that I mentioned last slide, we know as well-documented issues around racism in healthcare, fat phobia in healthcare, all of these things come together. The frequent experience that a lot of autistic people have of also having a number of chronic illnesses and conditions alongside, and longstanding issues around epistemic injustice for people with chronic illness. Sort of all of these come together within the healthcare context. And responding to a lot of these things creates a kind of demand to mask, a demand to kind of appear to be the correct in scare quotes kind of patients. So this is hard. So for example, whereas in a really crowded or stressful environment, like a waiting room, you know, something like stimming might help someone to self-soothe. This can risk eliciting negative reactions from other patients, reception staff, or medical staff. And there's percents for these from a study that are noted on the slide. So there was a view that it could create negative reactions from other patients, that kind of 15% maybe negative views, reception staff 9%, medical staff 7%. I mean, maybe these numbers aren't kind of huge in and of themselves, but it's also as well the factor of not knowing which people will have negative reactions. And that uncertainty itself can also drive anxiety about whether it's okay to stim, whether it's okay to pace, like how you have to perform a certain kind of appearance as a patient in order to be taken seriously and get the kind of care that you need to get. So the lens of thinking about harm vulnerability can help us think about how all of these interrelate and add up and contribute to each other, and how people are vulnerabilized in this context. But meanwhile, sort of thinking about openness vulnerability and sort of shifting the vulnerability economy, what would it look like to sort of think about enabling better openness vulnerability in this context? This might involve really actively working to reduce barriers and vulnerabilizing effects. So folks in the literature have suggested sensory audits, the ability to do online bookings, the ability to wait somewhere other than the waiting room. But we should also recognize that neuronormative pressures themselves lead to exhaustion and harm. So how could we maybe proactively signal acceptance of stimming, unmasking, and help make this possible? How can we educate reception and medical staff who may also be neurodivergent? And so this might actually contribute to a better working conditions, you know, for them as well. So how can we challenge neuronormative expectations of medical environments themselves? So with respect to openness vulnerability, some of the benefits of unmasking in healthcare contexts can include a reduction in shame, exhaustion. It can help create a community effect of an expectation of care regardless of proximity to neurodominant norms. And so this can involve a shift in thinking about health that recognizes our inability to completely control our body minds. So just to close, and I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm on track. So popular and self-help exhortations to embrace our vulnerability often downplay the structural, social, cultural, and economic factors that make it riskier or more difficult for some than for others. So this presentation has focused specifically on neuronormative dynamics hindering openness vulnerability for autistics. We argue for the need to shift the vulnerability economy so that those with less susceptibility to harm vulnerability from neuronormativity can help to make space and relieve neuronormative pressures. Recognizing the role of solidarity and community effort in making space for openness vulnerability has the potential, we think, to lead to broader liberation. Embracing openness vulnerability for autistics and allistics alike might involve valuing and being comfortable with autistic joys like stimming, flapping, and other forms of autistic playfulness. For many autistics, operating this shift by embracing our openness vulnerability means reconnecting with ways of being, doing, feeling, and reveling in the sensory that we've often consciously or unconsciously unlearned through neuronormative social upbringing and conditioning. For many non-autistic people, operating this shift by embracing their openness vulnerability means being open to the discomfort that learning autistic ways of doing or witnessing autistic practices like stimming or flapping might bring about without imposing judgment or constraints, and maybe even welcoming this discomfort. So kind of bluntly, when we say we want to shift the vulnerability economy, we mean, hey, how about less harm vulnerability for autistics and more openness vulnerability for everyone, which might have some discomfort along the way, but ultimately is good. And so that's why on this last slide, we have a quote from Nick Walker in her Neuroqueer Heresies, and I'll just share this quotation. Neuroqueer theory is in some fundamental way oppositional and defiant by its very nature. At the same time, though, it's also radically optimistic in its view that with sufficient engagement in neuroqueer practice, anyone can liberate themselves from the stricture of normativity. The already neurodivergent can reconnect with and cultivate previously suppressed or undeveloped capacities in order to more fully manifest their potentials for beautiful weirdness. And those whom we call neurotypicals are just potential neuroqueer mutant comrades who haven't yet woken up and figured out how to unzip their normal person suits. It's my favorite line, I think. So we think that by inviting this kind of practice, openness, vulnerability can point to the possibility of cross-group solidarity and allyship in bringing about the kind of transformative change that will dismantle neuronormative habits, expectations, and structures, these very same habits, expectations, and structures that can be sources of harm, vulnerability. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. So now we move to the Q&A session. I'm sure many people will have questions. None have appeared yet. I should also encourage the other panelists to think about what questions you may have and let me know by raising your hand or putting something in Q&A or just jumping in. And as I was speaking, something has appeared in the Q&A and Shelley's hand has gone up. So I'll take, Shelley, I saw your hand first, so I'll take that first and then go to the Q&A.
Good morning, Jane and everyone else. I want to give a description of myself since I didn't join Jonathan for the introduction to the session. So I'm a white woman with short hair and large plastic glasses. Behind me, there's a clock on the wall and a ceiling fan. So I wanted to, this notion of masking, I wanted to ask you about it, Jane. Do you see a difference between masking and passing? And because whenever I've seen, whenever I've read about masking, it's always been as a form, I guess maybe you could say as a form of self-protection. But can it not also be a form of passing and to gain advantage, for instance? Okay, I guess that's it.
Thanks, Shelley. I'm just quickly writing down your questions since I told Amandine I would give her a full report afterward. No, that's a good, it's a good question. It's something for us to think about. I will, there's probably a lot of really interesting work to be done on connections between passing as they have emerged in conversations around race, in conversations around sort of trans philosophy and politics, and masking in the ways in which it's been developed in the autistic community. And I think my gut feeling on this is that there's lots of similarities there, but I don't know if they're necessarily sort of interchangeable, but that could also just be my own lack of enough familiarity with a lot of the literature on passing specifically. One of the things that's tricky with masking is that sort of understanding understanding masking involves the ways in which masking behaviors are so often taught and inculcated from a really, really young age. Like, people are sort of praised for performing in really, really specific normative ways. They're like raised into it. And so often some people won't even realize that they are doing it until it's sort of been pointed out to them that they're doing it. So in terms of sort of being able to gain acceptance, yeah, yeah, probably. But also just sort of being able to sort of get by or get in the world or sort of navigate all sorts of different situations. So yeah, I think there's something interesting to be said there about the sort of about the connections, but I also think there's something distinctive about the ways in which autistics are receiving messages from their teachers, from their employers, from their parents from a very, very young age about having to perform in a kind of very particular way that is distinctive in the way that that autism has been treated as, you know, a disability to be managed, as opposed to just another way of being in the world. So I think there's something distinctive there. I don't know if that sort of fully answered your question.
You know, a lot of, you know, a lot of disabled people who wouldn't identify as autistic pass. And in those cases too, people would say that they're managing, you know, managing being disabled for the benefit of, well, you said acceptance, I would say advantage perhaps. So I'm still not sure that there's, I mean, I know that masking is particular to autistic people, and they're, you know, but I'm not sure that I can really see a difference between masking and passing, except that because they both involve, well, okay, so maybe we can both think about that.
Yeah, there's a good comment in, I just saw it pop up in the Q&A about if I can just sort of refer to that. So Ruby Hake writes, just an interesting place to add, some autistic people do refer to masking and camouflaging as, quote, passing as neurotypical, and many autistic trans people talk about how passing as their gender and as neurotypical are often very intertwined or even one movement. And then there's some and then there's some citations there that I'm just going to grab. So yeah, I think so.
Is that, sorry, but what you just read, is that in the Q&A or in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. The big, I mean, the sort of thrust of our paper has been sort of building off of, so there's, for example, back in 2018 on Twitter, there was sort of like a campaign kind of hashtag like take off the mask, right? There's a lot of kind of exhortations for people to unmask, to, you know, that sort of like broader kind of neurodivergent liberation involves sort of like unmasking. And so we've been curious to sort of see that, we've been curious to kind of see that push alongside, as I said, a lot of the sort of pop culture, like embrace your vulnerability. And I think the reaction we had was sort of like, okay, well, that seems like great in lots of ways. But how do we do so while acknowledging the sort of risks that it takes along the way? And so the kind of broader relational community effort that's required for people to unmask. So I think that's compatible with thinking that there might be all sorts of reasons that people might engage in masking. We're sort of interested with what enables people to unmask. So
I've taken up enough time. I just wanted to draw your attention to, Jane, to a comment that Abigail has made in the chat section. I'm going to sign off or leave right now. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So we'll get Abigail to ask a question just in a moment. But beforehand, there was a question that came up earlier in the Q&A, which I'll take from Naomi. So Naomi says, can you speak to the specific implications for philosophy, thinking of normal person suits in relation to the norms of depersonalized, non-idiosyncratic, generic personhood? So Jane, is that something you can respond to?
yeah, thanks Naomi for the question. I don't, just in interest of time, I'm going to try not to waffle on for too long. I mean, the thing that comes first to mind, weirdly enough, is John Stuart Mill in the sort of midst of On Liberty, where he talks about just the sort of need to value idiosyncrasy just on its own terms. And I think that there's something really important for people as they figure out who they want to be. Like a lot of my work on autonomy thinks about autonomy as this ways in which we work according to our values, goals, and commitments. A lot of figuring that out for ourselves involves trying different things, being different things, trying to be open to different things. And so I think that sort of allowing people to unzip the normal person suits might allow people to discover lots of really interesting different kinds of possibilities for themselves. You know, again, like something like Maria Lugones's discussion of sort of like playfulness and openness. So I think there are lots of really neat connections to other philosophical literature that could be made there.
Fantastic. So let us go to Abigail. Would you like to come onto the camera and ask
Sure.
your question?
Sure. I was just thinking throughout your talk that a lot of what you say applies not just to autistic people, but also I study people with severe mental illness. So I was thinking especially of that population, but also people with visible physical illnesses or visible physical disabilities where they might try to pass or I don't know if the word mask can apply to these populations, but at least passing. But sometimes they can't, or sometimes the cost of passing is just too high for them. And so I was just thinking about how it applied to other populations, and I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about that.
No, thanks so much for that question, Abigail. The danger with this particular project has always been that we start to want to sort of say, everything. And it's been an ongoing work of trying to say things that we think we can be, that trying to say things that come from some of our experience as well as our awareness of the literature and sort of broader communities discussions. So I don't have a whole, again, sort of interest of time. I think that would be great. I think it would be great if people, if the distinctions we are making make sense and are helpful and people pick them up for other contexts, I think would be super, super great. Does that sort of make sense? It's one of those things, I think there's enough, especially when we think of a lot of the risks and a lot of the contextual elements. I think there's a number of things that are saliently different in different spaces and different contexts where it would need a kind of careful analysis to find out, okay, how do some of these weighing of like risks and costs shift slightly or dramatically with different particular conditions or experiences and so forth. So I wouldn't want to like say definitively that, yes, this is a universal theory that fits all things. But I would love it if some of these distinctions can end up sort of traveling. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jane. And we'll move now to Cecilia's question, which is in the Q&A. It's quite a long question, but I think it's useful for me to read it out because the detail is helpful here. So, hi, Jane. Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. My question is rooted in the concern that I struggle with all the time with respect to my neurodivergence. I was wondering what the take on this question was by scholars of disability. I think there is great value in liberating oneself from social expectations, etc., such as harmful masking. But I also think that some occasions of what one might call masking should be regarded as something that is necessary as a matter of simply individuals learning how to navigate one's life as a member of society. In other words, I think everyone, not just disabled people, have such requirements and expectations that some of these are legitimate for everyone, including disabled people. For example, as a person with ADHD, time management can become very stressful, but I think it's important for those with ADHD to be able to learn how to properly manage their time as an aspect of working with others as a member of society. So I guess what I'm wondering is if openness vulnerability includes some sort of line between allowing openness and masking, which might be necessary for social cooperation.
Thanks, Cecilia. That's a great question. I think a lot of the sort of pressures of neuronormativity involve a lot of the pressures of neuronormativity and a lot of the sort of imperatives of invulnerability, which Aaron Gilson's 2011 paper in Hypatia is really, really good on. It's just such a good paper. Involve this kind of getting it all right, almost in a seamless kind of way. One of the things that I think openness vulnerability can allow for is people to acknowledge when they need help, to acknowledge when they need support, to acknowledge when they're not going to get it all entirely right. And so the sort of difference between, oh, of course I've got everything together because I am a perfectly functioning member, versus I'm really struggling with this. Here's some supports that I'm putting it in to be able to do it better. I might need help from other folks on this. Both are in service of, at the end of the day, trying to do some of the stuff that's important to us. but they're different ways of doing so that I think involve less shame about those times when it's hard. So that's my kind of provisional answer there about what some of the distinction would be. But I actually think that's really helpful, and I'll think about it further after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And we've got maybe not disrelated question coming up. I think this will have to be the last one from Berna. Could you speak to the challenges, vulnerability of trying to advocate for a possibly autistic colleague as an individual in a non-aware organization? It's difficult to shift an organization as an individual, and trying this also has an effect on one's own well-being.
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I wish I had a really good answer there, because I know we're sort of like, this is the thing we should try to do. I'm laughing because I think probably a lot of us in this room have tried to shift organizations in various kinds of ways. Yeah, I think without having a really sort of perfect answer for you, I think this is, again, our emphasis kind of kept coming back to community. And I think one of the dangers of a sort of short talk is that it sort of sounds like, you know, the sort of community operates as one, as sort of a strict binary. I think everyone needs sort of support and allies and like sort of solidarity and other folks in your corner for trying to do this work. I think it's almost impossible for folks on their own to do it. And so, you know, trying to figure out like who else within an organization might have similar concerns or might be open to stuff, and sort of slowly building other folks who can kind of work together on a project. That's not a perfect answer, but it's sort of where I would go, is sort of trying to think as much as possible, how can this not be done alone?
Okay, very good. Well, so as a chair, this has been a dream session for me, because not only has it been fantastic presentation and discussion, but the discussion has run out just about the right time for me. So I think we will first of all, let's thank Jane very much. As I've said before, on camera, I can clap if you can see me. Other people can show their appreciation in other ways, which we're seeing.
All the smart
now.
stuff is from Amandine.
And Amandine as well. That is also true. But the presentation was yours today. Welcome back. I hope you're with us again. I'm delighted to introduce August Gorman. August, you can see from the slide, is going to talk to us on discursive injustice and neurodivergent behavior, reclaiming agent meaning. So over to you, August.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you to you and to Jamie and to Shelley for putting together this conference. I'm really honored to be speaking in this terrific lineup. You know, it's a good conference when after every session you want to completely redo your presentation to incorporate what you've just learned. And our last session was no different, but I do not have time to redo it. So again, thank you. I am August Gorman. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns interchangeably. I am a white, non-binary trans man with a long beard and wireframe glasses. I'm wearing a green sweater. I have a blurred background, but I am speaking to you from my home in Detroit, which is the colonized ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, as well as the land of the Wyandot Nation. I have a content note for this presentation. There will be very brief mentions of violence and murder of neurodivergent people, so make sure to take care of yourself. There is a dyslexia and screen reader friendly version of my slides available at tinyurl.com/Gorman slides. That's GORMAN slides. There's also a QR code for this that will remain at the bottom left of your screen throughout the presentation. There's no additional content on the full presentation. It is green. Some of the titles are made to look like they're on a piece of masking tape, but there's nothing else additional. Okay, so with that, I will turn to the presentation. When I wrote the title of this presentation, I seemed to have some very ambitious goals of what I might accomplish. So I hope you'll forgive me for the fact that the claims I make will be a bit more modest than especially what that subtitle might suggest. Okay, so what I want to talk about is a certain form of neurodiversity-related discrimination and oppression. Now, I thought it might be useful in order to do that to just put on the table a very much non-exhaustive sample of some forms that neurodiversity-related discrimination and oppression can take. Not only is this non-exhaustive, but these forms are not mutually exclusive of each other. They are, in many cases, mutually reinforcing and overlapping. So here are just some of the forms of discrimination and oppression that we face as neurodivergent people. Employment discrimination, both implicit and explicit, epistemic injustice, filicide, disproportionate mass incarceration, forced institutionalization, lack of access to public life, medical discrimination, implicit bias, the instrumentalization of our stories and of our beings, and dehumanization, the naturalization of our disadvantages, eugenic public policies, and I want to add to this list, systemic behavioral misinterpretation. And that's what I want to focus on in this presentation today, just using some of the conceptual resources from philosophy to try to better understand and illuminate what this systemic behavioral misinterpretation piece of the puzzle might be. Okay, so what do I mean by behavioral misinterpretation, or something that goes wrong in behavioral interpretation? So there are a number of different things that can kind of go wrong here with the interpretation of some piece of your behavior. For example, maybe you're not trying to say anything at all, but your behavior is interpreted as though you're trying to say something. Maybe you're trying to say something via your behavior, but no one recognizes you as saying anything at all. Maybe you're trying to say one thing with your behavior, but it's misinterpreted as meaning something else. Relatedly, maybe you're trying to make a certain kind of like conversational move with your behavior, but it's misinterpreted as being a different kind of conversational move. Maybe you don't have a way of making certain behavioral expressions that will be legible to your interpreters, so your communicative scope is limited, right? That's a different kind of like problem that can happen with behavioral interpretation. Another thing that could happen is your behavior that is communicative or purposeful in some way just isn't engaged with as being communicative or purposeful or expressive. It's simply treated as desired or undesired behavioral outcomes. So these are just a number of ways that behavioral interpretation can sort of go awry. Okay, but you might say, people are misunderstood all the time, and that's not yet discrimination. For something to be a form of discrimination, it has to meet some sort of further condition. So I'm not wedded to any particular view about what discrimination means, but I thought I would just use a rough pass at a condition on what makes something count as discrimination that's offered in Scott Altman's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on discrimination. But again, I have no particular, weddedness to this view. I just thought it might be useful. Okay, so on this view, discrimination consists in acts, practices, or policies that wrongfully impose a relative disadvantage on persons based on their membership in a salient social group. are a number of parts of that that we might contest, and I'm certainly open to talking about that in the Q&A. Let's go with it for now. Okay, so behavioral misinterpretation does, I want to claim, happen to neurodivergent people because of neuronormative norms of behavioral interpretation. So what I really want to do is spend some time just thinking about some of these examples in conversation with one another. Many of these are not, novel things to think or talk about, but I'm hoping that by thinking and talking about them all together as of a kind, we might sort of get somewhere in further understanding the phenomena of neuronormative interpretive norms. So, okay, let's start with an example that some of you may have heard me talk about before. It's an example I come back to a lot in my work, and it is eye contact. So there's a lot to say about the topic of eye contact, but here's one of the things. For some neurodivergent people, trying to maintain eye contact with someone is very energy and attention intensive in a way that will make it less likely for you to actually be able to process what someone is saying. So you have a sort of forced choice. You can either actually pay attention to what someone's saying, or you can make eye contact and appear as though you are paying attention to what that person is saying. And so the way your eye contact is interpreted is almost exactly opposite of what it really signals. And this can have a lot of effects, many of them material, right? So are you going to make eye contact during a job interview? Are you going to understand the questions that are being asked of you? How much are you focusing on maintaining the perception that the interviewer thinks you're paying attention rather than are you going to pay attention? So that's sort of a core example I like to use to kind of anchor thinking about this kind of thing. Let's take another example. Unrecognized forms of nonverbal communication. So there are many neurodivergent people, and I should say that when I use the word neurodivergent, I mean it in about the broadest possible way that a person could use the word neurodivergent. So I want to be pretty much as inclusive as possible to any forms of non-normative ways of being. There are a lot of neurodivergent people who are sometimes or always nonverbal, who have ways of expressing themselves, communicating, etc., that just simply are not recognized as communicative by society at large. And I believe that that is because of neuronormative interpretive norms of behavior. Okay, another example, one which comes up in some of my other work as well. So I am an ADHDer. An example I like to talk about is the example of running late. Now, when someone runs late for something that, let's say, they've agreed to do, there tends to be an interpretation that that person doesn't sufficiently care about their obligation to be there on time, doesn't sufficiently care about the company that they're going to keep when, let's say, you've agreed to meet someone for lunch, etc. And, there are cases where someone runs late and it does mean that. In my life, there are times when I run late where it doesn't mean that. In fact, I care very, very much about the person's company. I care very, very much about my obligation. I may have even been implementing all sorts of indirect strategies to try to get myself there on time. And let's say I do all of that and still I'm like 1 or 2 minutes late or 3 minutes late, the person looks down at their phone for the time. And nevertheless, they think, August just does not sufficiently care. And that is a kind of interpretation that can happen, where all of this sort of emotional labor and indirect management and all of this stuff that's really going on that this behavior is or could be expressing doesn't actually get expressed. All of that is made invisible to the interpreter. So I think that's another form of behavioral misinterpretation that happens due to neuronormative norms. Okay. The next one, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, is a type of therapy offered primarily to autistic children, in which certain behaviors are attempted to be conditioned out of a person, and some are attempted to be conditioned into a person. Practitioners often use the terms desired behaviors or undesired behaviors to talk about this. There are a lot of reasons why this practice might be and has been harmful to people. And I don't want to claim that any particular percentage of that harm is due to behavioral misinterpretation of the kind I'm saying. But I do imagine that at least some proper subset of those harms have something to do with behavioral misinterpretation. For example, some of the behaviors that might be attempted to be conditioned out of people are things like stimming, or things like, yeah, I mean, so stimming of the kind that's an expression of joy, for example, or stimming that's an expression of overwhelm. Sometimes stimming isn't an expression of anything in particular, but right, sometimes it is. And those aspects of neurodivergent behavior in this context aren't engaged with. They're simply bracketed off or ignored or unknown. And I think that clearly falls under this rubric of the kind of thing I'm trying to get at here. Okay. There plenty more could be said about that, but for the sake of time, I'll push on. Another form of behavioral misinterpretation that others have had much more careful things to say about than I'll be able to here. Neurodivergent people sometimes have behaviors that aren't recognized for their expressive significance by others. And this can lead to sometimes judgments that that person is odd or bizarre in some sort of way. And this judgment of oddness can lead to testimonial injustice. So when that neurodivergent person then goes on to speak about their experience or speak about something else with authority, their authority will be implicitly distrusted and they'll be harmed in their capacity as knowers and in their capacity as, you know, authorities on their own experience. And this can have, again, pretty serious material effects. For one example, if you think about the medical sphere, or if you think about ongoing and looping effects with interactions with the mental health care system. So for more on that, a few theorists here who have written on this, Kurz and Grinspoon, Kidd and Carell, Gosselin. But I think that those judgments that sort of kick off that process are yet another species of this behavioral misinterpretation that I want to get at. Okay. Another example, people with Tourette syndrome sometimes have tics that offend people. So you've got two people, one who has Tourette syndrome, one who doesn't have Tourette syndrome. The one who doesn't have Tourette syndrome displays behavior that's looks identical. And in those cases, people will be offended by, for example, language that's interrupting or offensive language, maybe even slurs, right, that are uttered, or, just something that's otherwise disruptive. And what I think happens here is because we have neuronormative behavioral interpretive norms, there isn't usually a pause to say, I wonder if this person has Tourette syndrome, or I wonder if this behavior that I'm seeing is a tic. And the fact that there isn't that pause and there isn't that possibility that's considered is what I believe to be another instance of this kind of systemic behavioral misinterpretation. Right now, the onus is sort of on the person with Tourette syndrome to disclose. And as we know, there are a number of dangers to doing that. Okay, two more, but this really is, I think, this slide is the crux of my presentation, so I'll spend the time on it. My next example is meltdowns and police violence. So some autistic quote unquote meltdowns are expressions of sensory overwhelm. Are they communicative in nature? Well, sometimes I think they are. Whatever else they are, what I think we do know is that police and other emergency responders tend to not recognize a meltdown as being anything about sensory overwhelm. And this, again, here, stressing intersectional factors here can lead to disastrous outcomes. And they're disastrous outcomes that perhaps in some cases come about due to the fact that there aren't readily available interpretive tools for understanding what they're looking at. Now, I want to say that with caution, because whether you have those interpretive tools or not, there should be better ways of interacting with people. But part of what happens in some of these cases in a serious way, I think, has to do with behavioral misinterpretation. And the last one I'll just briefly mention, I'm not sure if it belongs on this list, but given what some of our other presenters have been speaking on, I thought it might be interesting to bring up. Effective masking due to discursive constraints might be thought of as a kind of behavioral misinterpretation that you, the neurodivergent person, participate in. But the reason you sort of feel compelled to participate in it has to do with these same neuronormative norms of behavioral interpretation. So if for example, a neurodivergent person doesn't have the same auditory processing speed as is expected that people will have in a certain social milieu, that person might develop masking strategies, right? This person might just start to say, yes, I understand, or, other sorts of phrases that make it seem as though they're processing at a speed that the other people expect them to be processing at. But due to that masking, this can then have downstream effects where, in some other situation, the person is using that masking strategy and is saying, yeah, sure. But actually, someone was intending to communicate something like of utmost importance and then gets mad when they find out, oh my God, you just said, yes, sure, but you weren't even listening to me and I was telling you something deeply important, right? And so there are downstream effects to that that can, I think, be traced back to those pressures to mask. So I think that topic is ripe for further exploration here, but I just wanted to flag the potential connection. Okay, so where does that lead us? Do the practices that condition our norms of behavioral interpretation impose a relative disadvantage? That's the first part of our working definition for discrimination. And I want to claim the answer to that is a clear yes. Neurodivergent people are at a significant disadvantage when it comes to being able to accurately signal our quality of will. So quality of will, without going too in depth, is something that many theorists, especially in the moral responsibility literature, talk about as being really central to a lot of our interpersonal practices. People are monitoring others' behavior in order to find out what the quality of their regard for us is. So this is something that happens a lot, maybe especially neurotypical people, if they exist, do a whole lot of this, but I think probably most people do engage in this monitoring of other people's quality of will to some extent sometimes. And it has real effects. So I'm going to briefly go through a few quotes that I think situate quality of will's prominence in our social practices with these potential harms that come about due to neuronormative interpretive norms. Okay, so my first quote is from Angela Smith in 2005, who says, "We often take what a person notices and neglects to have an enormous amount of expressive significance." The next quote, Manuel Vargas, 2020, "Many of our social identities, the significance of our behavioral dispositions, and the import of particular actions and practices is invariably experienced by individuals as saturated with a local meaning that is historically contingent." And my third quote here is from Michael McKenna in 2018. These full citations are on the linked slides, by the way, which you can find at the URL in the bottom left. "As the conversational theory reveals, quality of will is to be identified and explained by a community of interpreters who take some kinds of actions as indicative of goodwill and other kinds as indicative of lack of goodwill. Since some in this community are socially empowered, in contrast with others who are socially disempowered, the conditions for what signals good and ill will are liable to arise from potentially unjust social circumstances." And I would argue, actually unjust social circumstances that we have with respect to neuronormativity being an organizing principle of our norms of behavioral interpretation. Okay. So the next part, do the practices that condition our norms of behavioral interpretation impose the relative disadvantage that they do on the basis of persons' membership in a salient social group? So in other words, are the harms or relative disadvantages that come about through this misinterpretation coming about because neurodivergent people are neurodivergent? And I'm going to answer here that in many of the cases, at least, the answer is also yes. So I want to briefly introduce something very near and dear to my heart, which is the philosopher Anita Silver's counterfactualizing test, in order to try to figure out the answer to this question. So here is a quote. "Suppose that most persons used wheelchairs. Would we continue to build staircases rather than ramps? Suppose most were deaf. Closed captioning would have been the standard for television manufacture long before July 1st, 1993. By counterfactualizing about what society would do were persons with disabilities dominant rather than suppressed, it becomes evident that systematic exclusion of the disabled is a consequence not of their natural inferiority, but of their minority social status. And so how does this apply to the case at hand? Well, I like to think about how would we design our norms of behavioral interpretation if everyone in society had Tourettic tics? How would we design our norms of behavioral interpretation if everyone in the society were autistic, if everyone were an ADHDer, if everyone were dyslexic? And in thinking through this, if we end up finding that, oh wow, that would be quite radically different from the assumptions that structure our behavioral interpretations now, then we've learned something. We've learned that it's a result of the fact that those people are minoritized, that they're not included in the calculus of what our behavioral interpretive norms should be. Now, there are certainly difficult questions to figure out about how we sort of all together end up with some norms that are useful. That's why I'm writing a book, because that's a big project to try to figure out. And I don't claim that I've done that in this presentation. But my only point here is that we can use the counterfactualizing test to figure out whether it's due to the fact that people are part of a minority status that their behavior becomes unintelligible, given our interpretive norms. Okay, very briefly, the last key piece of my talk is this. I want to very briefly talk about the concept of discursive injustice and then gesture at a potential connection with what I've been discussing in this presentation. So, discursive injustice, what is it? To summarize and paraphrase Quill Kukla's 2014 paper on this, someone's speech act is not given appropriate uptake via the distortion of its performative force. This harms a speaker in their capacity to do things with words, due to, and further contributing to, a disadvantage they have on the basis of minority membership. So let's get a few examples on the table to try to better understand what we're talking about. The sort of classic example comes from Ray Langton in 1993, who writes about, in the context of sexist pornography, sometimes no, when spoken by a woman, does not, quote unquote, count as the act of refusal. So when, let's say, a man has been consuming a lot of pornography in which no is thrown around as just an odd and sexy way of saying yes to an invitation to sex, there can actually be some cases in which that man might then not be able to recognize the no of refusal as genuinely being a refusal. That's the concern, at least. Okay, so that's one example. Another example comes from Quill Kukla, also about sexism. So sometimes when a woman is trying to offer expert advice or expert information about something, it's not just that she's not taken that seriously by others and by men in particular, but that some men will actually not hear what she's doing as offering expert advice, but as an entreaty to join a conversation. And so the kind of thing that she's trying to do with words is distorted. Last example. This comes from Ethan Nowak in 2023, who's writing about the management of a person's perception of their speech that uses stigmatized sociolinguistic variation. So for example, stigmatized dialects of English, let's say. When you are managing the perception of your stigmatized dialect, he writes that you are unable, quote, to be yourself, to maneuver fully freely in social space in a way that others can. And this, he claims, is a form of discursive injustice. A concluding question for my talk. is behavioral misinterpretation and the resulting limitation of one's behaviorally expressive capacity a form of discursive injustice? I don't know. But I will leave you with a quote that suggests that there may be some sort of kinship. So as a concluding quote, this is from Mel Baggs. It's from Here Video, which is linked in the slides, called In My Language, or In My Own Language. And here's the quote. The way I naturally think, oh, I should contextualize that Mel Baggs, if you don't know, very important autistic advocate, self-advocate. The way I naturally think and respond to things looks and feels so different from standard concepts or even visualization that some people do not consider it thought at all. But it is a way of thinking in its own right. However, the thinking of people like me is only taken seriously if we learn your language, no matter how we previously thought or interacted. Okay, so I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much. I know I ran a little over time, but we can move to Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, August. I will applaud. I don't know if I'm on the camera at the moment, but other hands, golden hands are appearing. Okay, so as you know, questions in the Q&A, please. If panelists want to come in, use the raise hand function or get my attention some other way. But we'll start with a question actually that came up very early on the talk from David Dyer-Lawson, who says, in your view, does the neurodivergent category include people with mental illness? You noted in your talk that you favored a broad definition of the category.
I think I'm willing to just say yes to that. I think the answer to that is yes. But I invite further conversation about that topic. But yes,
Okay.
I think my answer is yes.
David, if you want to follow up with a bit more to explain what's at stake, that would be very helpful. In the meantime, I see Abigail's hand up, so let me pass over to Abigail.
Hi, August. Thank you. That was really interesting. So I was thinking about how behavioral misinterpretation is usually unintentional. People are trying at least sometimes people are trying their best to understand others, and they're making mistakes and having misunderstandings. And I was wondering what role you think intention plays in something constituting an injustice. So if a lot of behavioral misinterpretation is accidental, does it still count as injustice?
So that's a great question. Thank you so much. So I think my easy thing to say is that it's probably not a necessary condition on something being an injustice, on my view, that it be a result of intentional action. Now, that's easier said than done, than cashed out what that amounts to then. But I'll say a bit more. So I think that's quite right. You might have people who are, so to speak, fully well-intentioned, doing their best on some sort of conception, who nevertheless participate in a lot of misinterpretation of others' behavior. One thing is that I think I will probably say that people are complicit in an extreme lack of education about some of these topics that just needs to be happening but isn't. It strikes me as a huge oversight that, like, in our, at least in the United States, in our public education system, we just don't have times in which people, are forced to think about and understand the experiences of neurodivergent people in a way that would help them to be able to better interpret things that are going on for them. So I'm gonna probably end up saying people still end up bearing some sort of like responsibility of the kind that you bear for other sorts of kind of systemic oppression that you're participating in institutions that it upholds, etc. Um, but then the really hard question is, well, what does that mean in terms of how we then cash out, how to think about like is someone who misinterprets someone in like a really bad way, like blameworthy, responsible for that like particular instance? That's the really, really hard question. And to be truthful, I'm still working out kind of how to think through answering that. But something needs to be different. And I do think that it's still a matter of injustice, discrimination, and oppression, that we have the outcomes that we do right now, and that we haven't kind of radically restructured the way we go about doing this kind of interpersonal behavioral interpretation. And I guess last very brief thing to say is I do think it's possible for us to change, because on individual levels, people in individual relationships change the way that they interpret their partner's behavior or their child's behavior over time, all the time, I think. And what do we have to do to scale that up? Whatever it is, we need to be doing it. Okay, I'll stop there. So much more to say, but thanks.
Okay, so let's see, do we have any other panelists? Not at the moment. Oh, yes, we do. Shelley, of course. Do ask your question, Shelley.
Good morning, August. Thank you very much for your talk. So I wanted to ask you why it's necessary, why you think it's necessary, or why others think it's necessary to identify as neurodivergent, as opposed to disabled. I mean, some people identify as both, publicly identify as both in the writing, for instance, or on social media. But a lot of people tend to identify simply as not neurodivergent or autistic, or so why do you think that's necessary? When I started to identify as disabled, became disabled, the identity of neurodivergent wasn't available. I mean, maybe there were people who are identifying as autistic, but neurodivergent wasn't available. So, but I identified as disabled, and I don't feel inclined to go back. I don't feel inclined to start identifying in some other way. To me, the identity of disabled is a political identity that I don't want to give up. So I'm just wondering if you can respond to that.
Thanks, Shelley. That's a great question. And you always push me in really helpful ways. So to be fully transparent, on one of my first slides, I had the word disabled there, and then I changed it to neurodivergent. In my very beginning, when I'm listing, forms of oppression, it made sense to think about that as like, here are a number of forms of discrimination and oppression that disabled people face. And it's true. I only changed it there just because I felt like I wanted to just limit my scope for the presentation, because I thought I was, getting too big for what I could contain in my time. But there's a deeper question here, which is why people are attached to the neurodivergent label. And I think it's probably a mix of things. I use both personally, but I think part of it has to do with like bad stuff, trying to distinguish and cleave away from other disabled people in ways that are not good. So I think there's some amount of that going on. I think that there's some amount of what I've seen, autistic people who like the neurodivergent label and don't like applying the disabled label to themselves for, I think, a wide variety of reasons that I don't want to claim to speak to all of them, but I that seems to be the case. Yeah. I don't know. And I think it's important for me to be really careful in how I go about framing my project, and whether it's a project that's about disabled people or is it just about some subset of disabled people. And in general, my tendency is to think, I mean, a lot of this also would apply to people who wouldn't apply neurodivergent to themselves, but who would apply disabled. So that might be the way to go. So thanks.
Thank you for the answer.
Great. So David Lawson has added a little more in the chat. So we'll go back to that before we take your question, Berna, which we definitely will do. We'll have time for. So David adds, I understand neurodivergent as an umbrella category that includes all of the disabilities having to do with broken brains and the concomitant societal barriers that pertain. The political advantage of this large umbrella is that there is strength in numbers, and this impacts positively on our fight against depression. So I think, August, you wouldn't disagree.
I would not disagree.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
my tendency is towards the maximalism here of
okay. So can I push you a bit on this? Because
please.
when you talked about Anita Silva's counterfactual proposal,
Yes.
this, I don't, deliberately or not, brings you in contact with a lot of contemporary political philosophy, such as the work of Rawls and the original position and Dworkin's hypothetical insurance, which I know most people in philosophy of disability want to keep a million miles away from. But I did once find, talking to university administrators, I did once find the original position a useful tool to say to people, well, how would you design the university if you didn't know whether you were disabled or not? And that was quite useful. But when we add a whole range of other types of, say, brain damage, and we take the counterfactual test, you say, well, how would we design society if the majority of people were brain damaged? Would we get a design that would be appropriate given that most people are not brain damaged? That is there such a thing as over accommodating if we use the counterfactual test?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, I believe. So I'll say this. I don't think that we can use the counterfactualizing test to then get to a design of how we should now think about behavioral interpretation. What I think we can do is use it as a tool on the way to get there in order to figure out which of our interpretive norms might have been unduly shaped by an assumption that someone doesn't have Tourette syndrome or isn't autistic. So we can use it to kind of figure out which things we have are kind of illicitly snuck in there, but really it's neuronormativity that got them in there in the first place. Now, the harder question is, how do we go about designing the norms? I think that some norms need to be relaxed. So like we need to allow for the possibility that we just don't know what some behavior means and we keep multiple interpretations in mind. I think some norms just need to be changed or shifted in terms of I think I want to sort of draw on this, right? Like the vulnerability economy, like who has to change, who has to sit with discomfort, right? So there's very much a kind of distributive-ish thing going on where it's like we need some of the burdens to be shifted to someone else who now has to change the way they interpret rather than, deal with the fact that they're misinterpreted. But I do take that to be a political project. I do take that to be something that needs to have a lot of voices involved in it. I do take there to be like important moral and political reasons that we interpret people's behavior though, in general. And that will put some constraints on, we can't relax all of the norms so much that we're just not able to interpret people's behavior at all. Because I do think it plays a really important interpersonal and moral function. So yeah. it's just going to be way more complicated, and there's just more work to do in doing it. But I think your question pushes me to explain that there's so much more that we've got to do. Thanks.
Great. So I think, well, so what I take from that, I think is a great answer, that it's intended much more as a critical tool than a constructive
I think
tool,
so.
and we don't jump to a solution just from the test. Okay, excellent, thank you. So I'll take Bernard's question now. Interpretation, misinterpretation seems to be also connected with knowing whether the expression behavior comes about as a result of neurodiversity. What would be a right way to handle uncertainties about how to interpret expressions? It's a subtle question, I think, but clear enough.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I'll answer it this way. One of the things that I want to explore in further work and am starting to read more about is how autistic communities, like communities of just autistic people, navigate sort of like joint projects together. And I find that there is a lot of times like more explicit naming of what people are trying to communicate. There's also just, studies have found that like within a group of people who have like certain similarities, it's easier to coordinate action, and some of the across neurological difference communication problems don't exist quite as much when you've got people who are more similarly minded. But I want to look at other sort of ways of going about taking meaning from someone's behavior and then responding to it that are different from the way we do it right now. And one of those places I'm looking is in autistic communities and how they go about doing it. I think something to say here is that maybe the ideal of how this goes is really in like one-on-one, long-standing interpersonal relationships where we get to know another person on a very intimate level so deeply that we come to better customize our responses and better understand what that person's behavior might actually be meaning. That's kind of the ideal. And I'd like to be able to feel like we could scale up doing that kind of customization. The worry here is that there's a sort of forced vulnerability or a forced intimacy of trying to take that ideal and scale it up. So that's another sort of thing I'm pondering. I don't know the answer, but those are some directions I'm thinking about it in.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to say we are at the end of the time we've got allotted for this slot, so I'm sorry to disappoint the people who have questions still in the Q&A, but we'll send those on to August, make sure he has them so he can respond if that's the appropriate thing to do. In the meantime, please join me in thanking August for a wonderful talk and discussion. So let us give the time-honored. I love seeing this coming up on the screen. I'm not sure I know how to do it, but it's great to see it. So I'm delighted now to introduce Abigail Gorman. Sorry, not Abigail Gorman. Abigail Gosselin on mental illness stigma and devaluation of the relational self. And Abigail, over to you.
Hi, yes, I'm Abigail, or Abby Gosselin. I'm a professor at Regis University in Denver, Colorado in the USA. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair in a ponytail and glasses and a dark purple sweater. And I am sitting at my home while I'm doing this. So I'm going to share my screen, and I don't have slides, but I have the paper that I am reading, and I just thought for some people it might be helpful to read along with it. I know that that can be a better way to process information for some people. So mental illness stigma involves making a negative judgment about someone who has mental illness and marking them as bad or inferior in some way. Mental illness stigma devalues people in many ways. This paper analyzes several ways that mental illness stigma devalues the aspect of self that is relational and social. So stigma has several components, including stereotyping, which is a cognitive dimension of stigma, prejudice, which is an affective dimension of stigma, and discrimination, which is a behavioral dimension of stigma. Stigma also includes labeling, separation, or moral distancing, and status loss, which includes dehumanization. Mental illness stigma involves labeling someone as having a mental illness, applying negative stereotypes about mental illness to the person, feeling negative reactive attitudes such as disgust and fear toward the person, wanting to distance oneself from the person, believing the person is inferior to oneself, even subhuman, and treating them as such, and preventing them from having access to the same resources and opportunities that others have access to. Stigma consists of discrediting and devaluing a person based on that person possessing a characteristic that is considered negative to have. Traits such as mental illness are viewed as negative because they violate social norms about who a person should be and how a person should think, feel, and act in society. Some of the negative stereotypes we have of people with mental illness are that they are incompetent, needy, dependent, out of control, irrational, delusional, overly emotional, unreliable, dangerous, violent, immoral, defective, and incurable. These features are regarded as stigmatizing because they seem to violate social norms of what is required to be a human being functioning in a democratic capitalist society. When people project stigma onto those with mental illness, what is known as public stigma, they devalue the person with mental illness with respect to all aspects of the self, including their identity as a knower, as a moral agent, as a social and relational being, as a being with basic needs, as a unique individual, and even as a human being. When people with mental illness internalize mental illness stigma through self-stigma, they devalue themselves in all of these ways as well. This paper examines some of the different ways that the relational self is devalued and how this impacts other aspects of self. There are many ways that people with mental illness are devalued as knowers and as moral agents, and I don't have the space here to catalog these. Much has been written about the ways people with mental illness are subject to testimonial and hermeneutical injustices that devalue them as knowers, as well as paternalistic interventions that devalue them as moral agents. I'm happy to talk about these forms of devaluation in the Q&A if you want, but I'm not going to talk about them here. So one aspect of the self that stigma devalues is the relational self, the self as a social being. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the section where I explain the ways in which the self is relational and just summarize this by saying that social interactions and social relationships are crucial for moral identity, moral development, moral and epistemic agency and autonomy and self-conception. But I will start with talking about the value of being part of a community. Being part of a community is important for many reasons. A community provides a place where members of the community can engage with the epistemic, moral, and social practices required for developing and exercising epistemic and moral agency, as well as autonomy. In enabling epistemic agency and autonomous moral agency, participation in these practices helps with moral development and thus helps shape the moral and personal identity of an individual. Being able to participate in these practices as an equal member of the community compared to others requires that the community views the person as having normative authority and epistemic credibility. When a person is viewed as credible and authoritative, this helps them see themselves that way and provides an anchor to their self-identity that allows them to act as a legitimate moral and epistemic agent who has both the right and the capacity to engage in epistemic and moral practices alongside others in the community. A community also provides a sense of belonging. Belongingness is important for people to feel accepted, welcomed, and supported, all of which solidify a person's sense of self. Belongingness allows practices of affirmation, which Tim Johnston describes as an experience that reflects and sustains the self by upholding and valuing some aspect of it. It is thus an important process that helps create the relational self. Members of a community provide affirmation to each other when they accept each other as they are, when they welcome people into their social, moral, and epistemic practices, and when they encourage people to assert their strengths and to exercise virtues and skills in dealing with obstacles. Such practices affirm a person's worth, personal assets, and belongingness as part of the community, all of which fortify the person's sense of self and help form their self-identity. In addition, being part of a community enables a person to receive various kinds of support through that community. Communities can provide differing degrees of nurture, resources, and support, where some communities are impoverished, neglectful, or even harmful, while others are well-resourced and designed to aid their members. A resourceful and nurturing community can provide various types of support to its members. These include financial support, support in meeting the person's basic needs and fulfilling their interests, support in helping the person have the autonomy necessary to fulfill their own interests, and the encouragement and moral and emotional support that fortifies a person's ability to be resilient in the face of obstacles. In these many ways, being part of a community is valuable to a person's moral development, epistemic and moral agency and autonomy, and self-identity. An additional way that people are relational beings is the way they are dependent on and vulnerable to social, economic, and political structures that shape what kinds of lives they can live. Such structures condition the ways we can exercise agency and autonomy over our lives by enabling certain options for action and closing off others, in effect creating or disabling pathways that we can choose to follow. This creates the field of what opportunities and resources are available to us, affecting what options we can choose from and thus conditioning what kinds of lives we can live. As Judith Butler notes, we are dependent on various infrastructures that constitute our physical and social environment because of the way they shape the direction of our lives. This makes us vulnerable to how resourceful or impoverished these are and to what assets and opportunities they can provide. While we design social structures in part to protect us from our various human vulnerabilities, we are also deeply vulnerable to these social structures, which tend to be imperfect, insufficient, having limited knowledge and limited means of providing support, and are sometimes harmful and unjust. We can't help being dependent on the social, economic, and political structures that govern our lives. We have to create the best lives for ourselves that we can, given the possibilities they allow us and the constraints they impose upon us. So stigma hinders a person's ability to engage in social interactions, develop social relationships, and be part of a community, thus devaluing the relational self in several ways. One involves the shunning, avoidance, and social exclusion of people with mental illness. Social exclusion prevents people from having meaningful social interactions with others and impedes people from developing and maintaining valuable social relationships. Social exclusion outcasts people from a community so that they lose a sense of belonging, lose the opportunity for affirmation, and lose the ability to feel accepted, welcomed, and supported. Insofar as the self is relational, this negatively impacts a person's self-identity. Lack of community belonging also damages a person's ability to have the resources and support they need to be able to function in their daily life activities and in society, and to be able to get their needs met and pursue their self-chosen projects. Without a community, a person loses the financial, instrumental, and moral and emotional support that helps them act in ways that further their interests and enhances their well-being. People are interdependent and necessarily reliant on others to help them satisfy their needs and to be able to act as agents who can function in daily life and pursue their goals. Without a community, they lose an important source of help and support. In addition, social exclusion prevents people from having the opportunity to participate in social, epistemic, and moral practices that allow them to develop and exercise their epistemic and moral agency. It also prevents them from having the means to develop and exercise skills and virtues important for both kinds of agency, such as those necessary for autonomy. Without a community, a person lacks the means to engage in the practices necessary for epistemic and moral agency, thus impairing these. Other aspects of stigma impede epistemic and moral agency and autonomy as well, including the degrading of credibility and authority that accompanies negative stereotypes. When people are viewed as incompetent, dangerous, needy, or dependent, as many people with mental illness are, they are regarded as less credible, and their epistemic contributions are not taken seriously and are more likely to be dismissed and discounted. In this way, they are treated as having less epistemic agency, but in the process, they are also given fewer opportunities to exercise and maintain their epistemic agency. So not only are they treated as having less agency, but they often also end up actually losing some of that agency. When people are viewed as incompetent, dangerous, needy, or dependent, they are also regarded as lacking the normative authority to be able to take actions on their own behalf and to be capable of taking responsibility for their actions, so they are treated as having less moral agency. When a person is seen as not having normative authority, their actions are seen as not coming from them in an important way, or as being the product of forces outside the person's control, rather than as being the result of their own will and effort. For example, the actions of a person with mental illness could be seen as the product of their illness rather than as stemming from a person's own will. When a person is regarded as lacking normative authority in this way, they are given fewer opportunities to participate in moral practices with others, which reduces their ability to exercise their moral agency. Being viewed as having less normative authority thus not only treats the person as being less of a moral agent, but also actually decreases their moral agency, as they lose the opportunity to engage in the moral practices required for moral agency. People further lose epistemic and moral agency when they internalize the conceptions that others have of them and apply those conceptions to their own self-concept. Since the self is relational, how we are regarded and treated by others affects our own sense of self, self-worth, and self-identity. Others' conception of ourselves helps shape how we see ourselves. When others view a person as lacking epistemic credibility and normative authority, this easily gets internalized, so the person views themselves as lacking these too. When they view themselves in this way, this actually diminishes their epistemic and moral competence, hurting their ability to exercise the skills and virtues required for epistemic and moral agency, further eroding their credibility and normative authority. In a vicious cycle, the internalization of others' conception of a person as having degraded credibility and normative authority works to further damage these. In these ways, stigma devalues not only the relational self that is constituted by social relationships and ongoing social interactions, but also the self as an epistemic and moral agent whose agency depends on having a community with which to engage in epistemic and moral practices. Individuals are not only constitutively relational, but also causally relational, in that being part of a community is necessary for them to develop and exercise the skills and virtues involved with epistemic agency, moral agency, and autonomy. Stigma devalues the relational self in yet another way, by letting many people with mental illness live on the margins of society through endorsing a social, political, and economic structure that excludes some groups of people from certain domains in society. Many people with mental illness are homeless and/or unemployed. Sometimes this is due to active discrimination, but it also occurs through stigmatizing attitudes that prevent people and institutions from developing more inclusive structures that incorporate people with mental illness into places in society, such as housing and employment. Relationality is not just about the relationships a person has and the communities they are a member of, but also about the dependency and vulnerability they have to the social, economic, and political structures that shape what kind of life they can live. These structures enable and limit agency in various ways by allowing certain opportunities and putting constraints on others. Both active discrimination and stigmatizing attitudes create significant constraints on people with mental illness, severely limiting what options they have to pursue the kind of life they want to live. Discrimination against people with mental illness is not uncommon. Many landlords are unwilling to rent to people with known mental illness. A HUD report found that people with mental illness experience discrimination in being given information about available rental units and having rental units be made available to them. People with mental illness who are stigmatized and discriminated against have less housing stability and higher rates of homelessness. Moreover, many people with mental illness report experiencing employment discrimination. Surveys show that employers are reluctant to interview people with known mental illness, are less likely to hire people with known mental illness, and are more likely to repeal employment offers or fire employees when their illness becomes known. This is typically based on negative stereotypes and beliefs about people with mental illness as fragile and unreliable, incompetent and unable to carry out the responsibilities of a job, and not capable of competitive employment. People with mental illness who do have jobs are much more likely to have low-skilled jobs than high-skilled jobs. The effect of housing and employment discrimination is that this gives people with mental illness significantly fewer options in pursuing housing or a job than other people have, or than they would have if they didn't have mental illness. This reduction in options impairs their agency, where being able to make meaningful choices in directing one's life requires having multiple good options. When people are discriminated against, their opportunities and resources are reduced, leaving them with fewer options that they can choose from, and sometimes no options at all. Discrimination thus negatively impacts the self as a moral agent, but it also damages the aspect of the relational self that is dependent on social, political, and economic structures for its options for action. Stigmatizing attitudes also damage the aspect of the relational self that is dependent on social, economic, and political structures for shaping the kind of life one can live. Stigmas against incompetence, neediness, and dependence support neoliberal political and economic structures that are designed to exclude certain groups of people, such as people with mental illness. For example, stigmas against neediness and dependence violate social norms of self-reliance and self-sufficiency that help to uphold neoliberal political and economic structures that individualize problems and privatize solutions. The social norms of self-reliance and self-sufficiency value an individual's ability to function in society through their own hard work. In this framework, a person earns a job through their qualifications, experience, and expertise, which they worked for themselves. A person is able to acquire a house as a result of earning it through their own hard work and savings, where savings are the reward for an ethic of thrift and planning for the future. If we did not value self-reliance and self-sufficiency so much, we could create political and economic structures that provide assistance to individuals rather than placing all the responsibility for obtaining housing and a job on them. This would respect the ways individuals are sometimes dependent on others for help in functioning in society. Such structures could help place individuals in jobs, such as what is known as supported work, and help individuals to succeed in carrying out the responsibilities of a job. They could do a better job providing and helping to place individuals in safe and permanent housing. But we would have to respect, value, and accommodate neediness and dependency rather than stigmatizing these and outcasting people who are or who are seen as needy and dependent to the margins of society. Stigmas against neediness and dependence also violate the social norm of taking personal responsibility and accountability for one's actions and for the direction one's life takes. The neoliberal state values social norms of personal responsibility and accountability as part of the individualization of action and accomplishment. The neoliberal state views individuals in part as entrepreneurs, individual agents who get things done through their own effort and hard work, and who are able to sell the product of their work, their accomplishments, in the marketplace to rational, self-interested consumers. As entrepreneurs, individuals create products and accomplish goals through their own individual action, and the responsibility for these products and achievements and the actions that led to them is located solely in the individual who has worked on them. Moreover, what actions a person takes is seen to be the outcome of choices the person made as a self-interested, rational chooser, for which they are thus responsible and accountable. Consequently, the responsibility for the conditions a person finds themselves in is individualized, so that individuals are held personally responsible for their choices and actions. Thus, individuals are personally responsible for what they do and achieve and for the conditions that they find themselves in. Existing social structures create obstacles for people who are unable to achieve their self-chosen goals on their own and be personally responsible for what happens to them. The neoliberal capitalist economic system is set up in such a way as to exclude some people from entering the housing market because it is too expensive and they do not make enough money from whatever job they have, if they have a job, or they have no other financial means to buy or rent. In addition, some people are excluded from entering the job market because they lack education, qualifications, and training, and they often lack access to these because they cannot afford the price of college, vocational training, and their licensure. And in some cases, they cannot succeed in college or vocational training without assistance, which is not normally provided. In our neoliberal capitalist society, housing and jobs are only available to people conditionally, and if people do not meet the required conditions, they cannot have access to them. If we had different social norms about how a person should succeed, however, other than the neoliberal ideals described above, we could create a society with a stronger social safety net that provides housing and jobs to anyone in need of them, regardless of whether they meet certain conditions. And the systems that provide such housing and jobs could find ways to enable people to meet those conditions through providing aid and assistance. People who depend on others to help them get their needs met and to help them accomplish tasks and achieve goals violate social norms of personal responsibility and accountability because their dependence on others makes it so that they are unable to take responsibility for their own actions on their own and unable to be accountable to others for their actions. People with mental illness are thus frequently stigmatized on account of being unable to take personal responsibility for their condition, both for their mental illness and for the social conditions they are in as a result of their illness, and consequently blamed for this. And by social conditions, I'm again thinking of people who are homeless and or unemployed. This individualization of responsibility and blame results in further marginalizing people, such as through the criminalization of homelessness. Homelessness is criminalized in part because it is viewed as a problem of the individual who is homeless rather than as a social problem requiring social response. Homeless people who are arrested for sleeping in public, for example, are held responsible and blamed for their action as if they had control over what they did and as if they had made a choice between options as a self-interested rational chooser. If we regarded people's social conditions as a result of structural obstacles instead of as a result of personal choices, we would find ways to give homeless people the social and structural support that they need to exit homelessness as part of our social responsibility. Since we instead view people's social conditions as the product of personal choices and actions for which they are personally responsible and accountable, however, we hold them responsible in a way that blames them for their actions, such as through the criminalization of homelessness. Stigmas against incompetence, or what we can think of as difficulties with functioning in various life domains, including mental capacities, social interactions, and tasks of daily living, also place people at the margins of society. Problems with functioning are seen as violating social norms of individualistic autonomous agency, where a person has the capacity to get their own needs met, to set goals for themselves by themselves, and to accomplish their goals through their own action, and of the rational self-interested chooser who has the competence to assess different options themselves and to select options based on reasons that are personally important to them. When people cannot meet their own needs themselves, when they cannot accurately assess and choose from different options, and when they cannot accomplish their goals without help, they're stigmatized as violating these ideals and excluded from making choices in the marketplace as a way of accomplishing their aims. If we did not value individualistic autonomous agency and the ability to be a rational, self-interested chooser so much, we could design political and economic structures that support and give more opportunities to people in exercising their agency and their relational autonomy. We could create what Martha Feynman calls a responsive state that sees itself as having the obligation to help people function in society and be integrated into various domains of society, thus respecting the fact that we are relational selves that need to be part of communities to have agency, autonomy, and a positive self-identity. Instead, we have a neoliberal state that idealizes the atomistic individual in their personal choice, hard work, goal setting, and accomplishments. Such a state privatizes functioning in society and in daily life as the problem of the individual, where the solution is for the individual to take personal responsibility for their actions and their condition, rather than as a social problem requiring social response. Devaluing the relational self through stigmas against incompetence, neediness, and dependency also devalues the aspect of self that is the self who has basic needs. As human beings, individuals have basic needs that must be met in order for a person to have basic survival and ideally thriving. Basic needs for things such as food, clothing, housing, a job as a means to attain financial security, basic health care, and some level of education must be satisfied for a person to be able to survive as a human being, to be able to function in society, and be able to participate in the social, moral, epistemic, political, and economic practices of a community, and to have their basic well-being fulfilled. However, we cannot usually get our needs met completely on our own. The social norms of a neoliberal state create expectations that the individual can meet their own basic needs themselves, such as through their own hard work and action. But people are not omnipotent, and most, if not all, people have various limitations, vulnerabilities, and structural obstacles that prevent them from being able to act in ways that get their needs met all on their own. People are necessarily interdependent on each other and on society to satisfy their needs and further their interests. If we respected and appreciated this inherent neediness and interdependence more, we could design a society such as Feynman's responsive state that sees as its obligation to respond to people's neediness and vulnerability by helping them to get their needs met, and thus honoring the aspect of self that has basic needs. Instead, we stigmatize these. In dishonoring incompetence, neediness, and dependency, stigma relegates people who have these conditions, or at least who are seen as having these conditions, to the margins of society, excluding them from being able to participate in various domains of social functioning. In this way, stigma devalues various aspects of the relational self, where a person needs to be part of a community to have the opportunities to develop and exercise the capacities required for agency and autonomy, and for functioning in various like domains, to have the sense of belonging so important to self-worth and positive self-conception, and to have the resources and support of a community necessary to aid them in getting their needs met and helping them to further their own interests and well-being. Respecting the ways in which the self is relational requires us to eliminate mental illness stigma so that people with mental illness can thrive as relational beings.
Well, thank you so much, Abigail, and we'll do the traditional praise and applause with the hands and the hearts coming up more.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so it tells me there are 4 questions in the Q&A, but I think they're actually ones left over from the last session. So we would very much welcome questions. I think Jamie, they can all go from the last session if you're looking at the timing. So if any panelists would like to ask their question, now is the time. If not, then I can start us off. So I found this idea of the devaluation of the relational self a really important part of stigma. And I don't think I had thought of stigma in those terms before. So, I mean, so do you see this as a type of departure from the sociological discussions of stigma, or do you think this is something that is continuous, say, with the sorts of things that Goffman said about stigma? And so is this a new theory of stigma, or are you applying a getting us to a new understanding of stigma in this context?
I think it's a new dimension of stigma to think about. I don't think it's a wholly new theory. I think it's a development of different ways that people think about stigma. But Goffman, as I understand it, thinks about stigma largely in terms of interpersonal interactions, the way people interact with each other. And I think that that is a really important piece of stigma that has to be examined. And I have looked at that in some of my previous work. But I think that looking at the structural component of stigma is also very important. And I think that I am doing something somewhat new with that. I'm sure it's not totally original. Off the top of my head, I can't think of sources that develop that structural component of stigma, but I'm sure they exist, at least in the sociological world. I'm just not as familiar with that literature.
I mean, the literature I know, and I only know a tiny part of it, tends to think in terms of stigmatized groups. But I'm wondering now with mental illness, is it the group? Does the stigma start from the group membership, or does it start from unusual behaviors, which then lead to stigma?
Well, I think it's both. And that connects with questions about labeling, like to what extent does labeling matter? So stigma sometimes just comes up with, sometimes arises when people have unusual behaviors, they're talking to themselves, or they look very unkempt, or different kinds of signals that they give off. And those signals make others uncomfortable, and they can give rise to stigmatizing reactions. And I think that connects with what August was talking about with the behavioral misinterpretations, where you don't really understand why a person is doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying. And so you misunderstand them, or you attribute features to them that may or may not apply. And so sometimes people attribute mental illness to people who may or may not actually have it, but they're giving signals that indicate it. So it does operate on that level. But also the group membership, I think, does also apply if you believe, if people believe that someone has mental illness, then it automatically invokes stereotypes that we have floating around our culture about mental illness. Even if we don't actively endorse those stereotypes, even if we don't agree that people with mental illness are incompetent, needy, dangerous, etc., we're aware that those stereotypes exist, and it affects how we interact with people that we believe to have mental illness. And so I think the group membership also applies. I think both can give rise to stigma very easily.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, what's so interesting for me about this talk, in addition to the talk itself, is the way it connects with other literatures. And so I'm sure you know that within the political philosophy around equality, the notion of relational equality is very important now. And in feminist theories of autonomy, the notion of relational autonomy as well. So if stigma is a type of damage to relationships, that would also include damage to equality and damage to autonomy following from those literatures. So it would be very interesting to see those connections being developed more.
Absolutely. And the section of the paper that I didn't talk about was about the value of social relationships. And I was relying largely on the literature of relational autonomy and that. But the literature on relational equality, I have not given much attention to. So that's really important for me. So thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, well, it'd be very interesting to see it develop. So I've got a couple of questions. I've got Cecilia in the chat in the Q&A and Shelley on screen. So I'll go to Cecilia first and then to Shelley, if that's okay. So Cecilia says, thank you for sharing your paper with us, Abigail. I really appreciated the discussion of the various ways in which mental illness can be related to stigmatization and the devaluing of the relational self. My question is more a suggestion, especially if you're interested in filling out your paper a bit more. Have you considered incorporating how shame might be related to the concerns you raised in stigmatization and self-devaluing?
Absolutely. I'm working on a book right now about self-care in the face of stigma, how stigma undermines self-care. And the role of shame is really important in that because shame results often from internalizing stigma, and internalizing stigma is very common for people who are stigmatized against. And so a lot of people who are stigmatized against feel shame for whatever condition they have that they're stigmatized against. And that affects all kinds of things, including their self-worth and self-esteem and their ability to have things like self-confidence, self-trust, and other self-regarding traits. And it even impacts how they're able to be agents, how they're able to have autonomy, create goals for themselves, work toward their goals, and implement action. So shame affects all of those things. And I am working on that right now. So I don't know what more to say about that at the moment. But yeah, I'm working on a chapter on exactly this topic right now. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great, thank you. And Shelley, for you.
Hey, Abigail, a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. The presentations in this session have fit together so well, I think. Abigail, I wanted to draw your attention to some comments in the chat. One drew attention and thanked you for your remarks and wanted to connect them up with exclusion from the professional philosophy, which of course is something that I'm very concerned about. But a couple of others asked if you would be making your presentation available somewhere, and so maybe you could respond to that. Thanks very much.
I'm happy to email it to anyone who wants it. I don't know how to make it available on the internet. I don't have a personal website or anything. I just have this Word document that I can email to anyone who's interested. I will put my email address in the chat.
Well,
so
can I make a suggestion, actually?
Oh, sure.
If you are so inclined, I would love to print it on the to publish it on the biopolitical philosophy blog. That's one option if you want to do that. Maybe you could send it to me later on today or whatever, and I'll publish it. Thanks very much. So
Yeah, happy to do that.
for those who inquired in the chat, I'm going to publish Abigail's talk on biopolitical philosophy, which I can send the link to biopolitical philosophy. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat momentarily. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you.
Okay. So Shelley, your hand is down now. Do we have any other questions or comments from anyone at this point? Abigail, anything you would have liked to have added if you'd have a bit more time?
Not that I can think of. I really enjoyed working on this paper because it's going to be part of, like I said, part of this book that I'm developing. In that book, I talk about psychological conditions for self-care, epistemic conditions for self-care, social conditions for self-care, and structural conditions for self-care. And this paper addresses mainly the social and structural conditions for self-care and how stigma thwarts these. And so it has been a pleasure to work on this paper as I'm thinking through this book.
Okay. Well, in that case, we're only a few minutes earlier than we would have if we'd gone right up to time. And I think we have had a very long session and that people will be very grateful for a bit more break. In the meantime, can we thank not just Abigail, but also Jane and August for their presentations for, I think, what has been a marathon session, but a wonderful session at the same time. So thank you very much.